Hi there, I'm John. I created this verse-by-verse scripture study for those who would like to thoughtfully expand their study of the scriptures beyond basic gospel principles. I think this could be particularly helpful for teachers who are looking for ways to more meaningfully engage with their students and with the text, and I'm certainly approaching this from having held many teaching callings within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is designed to move from the milk-based diet, which the Apostle Paul talks about and warns against beyond initial conversion, and into a more meat-based diet that requires some more thoughtful chewing, swallowing, and digesting of the Word of God. Welcome. Jumping back into Genesis chapter 6, we are in verse 11. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. This word corrupt is the Hebrew word sahat. And I referenced this briefly in the last video, but essentially this has a connotation of something that is spoiled. That's something that is no longer useful. In certain contexts, and arguably in this one, something that is no longer life-sustaining or life-giving. It can literally mean ruin. And so corrupt is absolutely a great translation here. And when it says that the earth was filled with violence, it is the Hebrew word Hamas, which means violence. It can also mean injustice or wrongdoing. Now, I'd like to pause here because in modern political contexts, you see this word and there is an implication. This is not to be confused with the Arabic word Hamas, which means strength or courage or zealousy or zeal for a cause. And so when you're talking about something like the Islamic resistance movement, that phrase in Arabic, the way that it reads out is actually an acronym. And they thought it was an appropriate acronym because of their worldview, their philosophy, that they believe they're taking up strength, courage, and zealousy for a cause. So just to be clear and to make sure that nobody's walking away with a misinterpretation or a misconception, the Islamic resistance movement has nothing to do, at least in the way that they framed the movement and framed the name of it, has nothing to do with injustice or wrongdoing. The Hebrew word Hamas does pop up throughout the Old Testament, throughout the scriptures. And it typically has a connotation of some kind of a structured, systemic harm or injustice. So it is used sometimes in the context of war or state violence. The Bible uses it when talking about oppressing the foreigner or the stranger within one's own lands. It is used in the context of oppressing the poor. It is used in the context of dispossession of property and displacement from lands. The Bible uses it generally in the context of unjust laws. And when Genesis chapter 6 frames this violence and this corruption as happening before God, this strongly implies some kind of exposure to God, meaning there is, at some level, accountability for these things. In almost every case that the Bible uses this word and its context in structured systemic injustice and harm, It is very clear that regardless of how hidden it is, or regardless of how normalized it is, God sees injustice. He sees crimes against humanity. He sees exploitation and predatory behavior, even predatory legal behavior. He sees it and he judges it because in almost every case, those things are detestable to him. Speaking this very clearly for those in the back in this, the year of our Lord, 2026. Verse 12, and God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. Verse 12 repeats this theme of corruption 2 more times. We saw this with the theme of God repenting that he had made man and all living things. It repeated that 2 or 3 times in the preceding verses. Here it's repeating this idea of corruption twice. Remember, this text is coming from a position of assuming the flood narrative. It was a cultural assumption. The authors of Genesis are trying to weave this narrative in order to create a moral justification for why the flood happened. So you're going to see stuff like this where it's very clear, driving that point home, that there is this irreversible kind of corruption on the human condition. And then you get to this point where God is addressing Noah for the first time in the text in verse 13. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. This phrase, end of all flesh, it's this Hebrew word kes, which literally means like an end point. It can also mean a termination. Generally, the way that it's used is it says something has run its course. Or in other words, we cannot keep going on any longer. This has to end. It repeats the word violence once more. And it says through them, meaning through humanity. Violence through them. That is to say, violence because of them. Unlike other ancient Near Eastern flood myths, where sometimes the reason for the flood is almost arbitrary or silly, like in one, the gods get annoyed at the humans for making too much noise. In this story, it's a demythologization of the other pagan flood myths and a reinterpretation that there is a moral justification for the flood. It is humanity at fault. Or in other words, humanity is explicitly named in the text as the cause for why God had to flood the land. There's this interesting phrase here too in verse 13, I will destroy them with the earth. It's an unclear translation. There's some that assert this should be, I will destroy them along with the earth. There's also this idea of by means of the earth. I think that one probably reads a little bit better. Remember when in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, we talked about the ancient Near Eastern idea of cosmology. You have the earth here. It's a flat earth model. And above the firmament, it's the waters of the heaven. And then beneath you have the deep, or the waters below. And when we get to the actual flood portion of the narrative, it does say that the floodgates of heaven are opened up and the fountains of the deep burst forth. And so I think this idea of I will destroy them with the earth probably reads better in the context of what we've seen thus far.
Earth is just the land part. Isn't he really destroying them with the waters?
Say again. How do you mean?
So I don't know. I guess when I think of I'm going to destroy you using the earth, then I think of I don't know, a landslide or the earth opening up, with a big fissure or something like that.
That is the way it's read.
But then he actually did it with water though. Really, he just let the deep and the flood waters of heaven wash them all away.
I think it's part of their earth model.
Okay,
right?
So it's still part of the earth because it's nature. It's part of nature.
Yeah, or part of the the vivarium that humans exist in, kind of a thing. That something structurally changes with the world around humanity and there is a destruction. Because it does say that the fountains of the deep burst forth, the windows of heaven open up. So you get this idea that through natural causes that God has created and set up, it's now going to be the means of destruction. At least that's how I read it. You could say that you could interpret it that other way. I will destroy you along with the earth, but the earth wasn't destroyed.
Exactly.
Which is problematic. Yeah. All right, we're going to spend the last and majority portion of this video talking about the procedural instructions to build the ark and some of the ins and outs of the way that it's talked about, beginning here in verse 14 and all the way through verse 16. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it of. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above. And the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof. With lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it. First and foremost, let's look at this word, ark. This is a lot more complicated than you might give it credit for, because this word, teva, does not mean boat. It doesn't mean ship. It doesn't even really mean vessel, like you would see, like a navigational vessel. The true meaning of the word teva is unknown. To this day, no scholar knows what it means. They can't even trace it back to a root word. So they can find certain words that maybe, sort of, if you squint hard enough, maybe relate. And those words could be something like a chest, or a coffer, or even like a container of some kind. But that is just a best guess. No one knows what teva means, because it's only used twice in all of Scripture, and nowhere else in human history has this word been found. It's kind of weird. If you wanted this to appear like a ship or a boat, you would use words to describe that kind of a thing. But Genesis doesn't, ever. It doesn't even use it synonymously. It just avoids those words, which means this is to be seen as something else entirely. In both instances where this word is found, there is a common through line. It is a floating container filled or covered in pitch. It is set out onto water or waters. It is exposed to certain depth. It is for the preservation of life, with the intent, what comes out of that is the continuation of covenant. Or I think more specifically, you could maybe insert in here some kind of deliverance that leads to the establishment of covenant. The first instance, obviously, Genesis chapter 6. The second instance, Exodus chapter 2. The word teva is the basket that Moses was placed in as a baby. What this is literally telling an ancient reader, who, especially in an Israelite context, would have been incredibly familiar with Moses. Moses was to the Israelite people what Joseph Smith is to Latter-day Saints. You know that story. You know the ins and outs of that overarching Joseph Smith history and narrative. They would have understood Moses' history. This story was very important to them, as it as it led up to the creation of them being a covenant people, I think what this is doing is drawing a comparison. There's like a mirror image here. And so an ancient Israelite can look at the story of Genesis chapter 6 and say this is kind of a typology of what ends up happening with Moses. All of these themes, they're a pattern by which God works to preserve a remnant people. Based on this context, based on these best guesses, you could maybe translate Teva to mean life box, or very simplistically, just a floating vessel. But again, it's one of those mysteries of scripture study. The only other thing to mention there, I don't have it in my notes here, but it says the ark was to be made of gopher wood. Has nothing to do with gophers, the animal. In fact, nobody knows what that wood is. So it's another word that they can't even trace it back to I think that one maybe has a root, but they're not sure. They just don't know. So the word gopher, I think, is phonetic, and there's just no known connection with any type of tree or wood. It's just anyone's guess. So it is curious that two of these seemingly very important words to the narrative of the story, Teva and gopher, it's just like, what is this? It could be that the authors of Genesis are creating this sort of primeval lore, similar to maybe how like J.R. Tolkien just creates concepts, creates names for things in this ancient history. It's not intended to be a real thing at all. And maybe that's why the authors are assigning these nonsense names to it, is that it's not meant to be like anything else. This is something that's established in this very ancient, important history. So that's maybe an idea. Let's talk a little bit about the ark, specifically the dimensions of the ark, which are listed at 300 by 50 by 30 cubits. This would be a ratio of 30:5:3, or if you wanted to do like a length by width ratio, it's a 6:1. If you compare this with other known discovered Mesopotamian barges, most of those tend to be in a range of 5.1, or sorry, 5:1, all the way up to 7:1. So this falls kind of right in that happy medium of, again, known, discovered Mesopotamian barges that were set out to sea to some degree.
Can you explain that math for me real quick? How you got from 30:5:3 to 6:1?
Yeah, so this is just the height. So I'm ignoring the height. 30:5 is a 6:1 ratio.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's this would be the length by the width, which is essentially this is a pretty good window to create a floating vessel. It's just a box. But if you create that with a 6:1 beam ratio, it will float pretty reliably. The important part about a barge like this is it is entirely about endurance, not control. And perhaps another reason why they're not using ship-like words, because this has no navigational system. This has no wheel or rudder. It's just a life support vessel that is intended to hopefully survive or endure whatever this thing is. But it is at the whim of the waters and the wind and things like that. If you are interested in this word, this unit of measurement, this is a pretty common ancient Near Eastern unit of measurement. We have found it pretty consistently and used pretty consistently in terms of the meaning with Egyptians and with Sumerians, and indeed in Canaanite architecture. The general rule is that a cubit is the tip of your elbow to the end of your fingers. And so it's going to be a little different for everybody depending on how big your forearm is. But that's the general rule. Now, this is based on the rule of digits. So one digit is one finger width. So this was a standard unit of measurement. Then you had the unit of palms, which was 4 digits. So if you do that, you can kind of see, okay, my palm is more or less four fingers wide. Then you have the common cubit. There were a couple different kinds of cubits. So the common cubit was 6 palms, or in other words, 24 digits. And this actually works pretty well. If you start at your outer elbow and measure 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that holds up pretty well. If you wanted to look at the royal cubit, which was more common in like temple architecture. So like when you're reading through cubits in temple construction, it's going to be the royal cubit measurement. And that is essentially the common cubit plus 1 palm. So they would just add an extra 4 digits on top of the common cubit. It is not clear which this is talking about. There's maybe an argument to be made for the teva, that is to say the ark, being sort of symbolic of temple imagery. You kind of have to squint and you really have to look at it from a modern spiritual view. So maybe you could make an argument for royal cubit. It's not clear. We'll just take this one here, 300 cubits. Depending on if it's common or royal, this is going to be anywhere between 450 feet to 515 feet. If you go to the Creation Museum in Kentucky, which is a kind of young Earth creation science, I would say pseudoscientific model, where they have built a full-size 300 by 50 by 30 cubit ark. They use the royal cubit measurement. So theirs is, I think, exactly 515 feet long. Now, speaking of young Earth creation science, pseudoscience models, not to disparage anybody who maybe feels a certain way about it, that interprets these words and this text to be hyper literal. Just to be very transparent, that I don't interpret this hyper literally whatsoever. I think this is allegory and parable at best. It's borrowing from existing traditions. We've seen this pattern all the way from Genesis chapter 1, and I don't think this is or should be seen as any different. But that being said, I know there are a lot of people out there, especially in the USA, that tend to see these things as hyper literal just because that's like our cultural tradition. And if I'm not mistaken, I think our church still kind of teaches this as literal. Would you agree? Did you grow up being taught that this was a literal account? Like a literal worldwide flood, literally saved the animals?
I'm not sure if it was explicitly stated, but it was at least spoken of in that way.
Okay.
I think a lot of things in the LDS church, it's kind of, unless it's particular to our doctrine, you can kind of decide for yourself and your family whether you're going to believe in a literal 7-day creation or not. And because the church doesn't want to make anyone feel on the outs. So like if it's not that important or that pertinent to strictly LDS like beliefs, my understanding is it kind of like lets you decide what you feel most comfortable with.
Yeah, I think that's
So,
fair. I I think there was probably a time back when the church was more openly anti-evolution, for example. I think some of these things would have been perceived more hyper literal. I mean, I know we still teach literal Adam and Eve because
yes, we
I
do.
hear it I hear it during missionary lessons. We start
Mm-hmm.
talking about the problem of evil and we jump right into this myth of the first man and first woman. And I think we almost have, I've talked about this in the creation videos, we almost have more of a tough time with not seeing a literal Adam and Eve because we have actual LDS doctrine tied to the person of Adam being Michael the archangel and the first spirit child to put, be put immortality on the earth, and
Exactly.
we're all descended from that as part of our human condition. But
And I've heard definitely like logic statements using the flood as though it was literal, and
mm,
and things like that. And so, and the reason I'm saying they let you kind of decide is I think in the past it was very literal, especially with like the 7 days of creation.
sure.
But I have noticed in the last, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so, that now they're saying, okay, well, we don't want to ostracize the scientific community. And so we're saying, well, it could have been, instead of a day could have meant a period of
An
time.
age.
Yeah, it could have
Yeah.
been a specific period of time. So 7 periods of time was, and so you see the flexibility to the point where they're not going to say one way or the other, specifically, not doctrinally. So you can kind of like each family, each member can kind of choose for themselves what they're going to do. And I think that's strategically done.
I think so too. It's and I like that they're trying not to ostracize one side or the other. You do have to ride the fence a little bit, but I was just curious what your experience was. So I grew up in a very hyper literalist biblical model, evangelical, non-denominational settings growing up, and I mean, I visited the Creation Museum when it was almost brand new. My church, one of the main churches I went to, would invite people in, guest speakers, people like Ken Ham, who are like strict, yeah, the earth can't be more than 6,000 years old. And it's interesting to see. I think it's dogma at play. I mean, it's certainly like attached to the way that things have to be because that's the way we've always thought about them and done them. And there's almost this fear of like, if the earth is 4 billion years old, then the Bible's not true. And so we have to like hold that line forever. Um, Look, there are a lot of problems with the Ark story. There are a lot of problems with the flood story. And I want to get into it a little bit just in case any viewership maybe hasn't thought about some of the implications of well, why people such as myself say this isn't possible, that this has to be myth. This is a story that someone created without any knowledge of the world. And for the sake of argument, I'm happy to disregard these problems as I bring them up because I think there's actually one very big problem that shows up in the text itself. And so I want to get to that problem where I think this is kind of the crux of the issue. But I do want to bring up some of these other areas real quick here. So, assuming we can disregard geological problems. In our geological record, there is no worldwide sedimentary layer. There is no universal marine deposit. There is no evidence of global erosion or a global erosion event within human history. And I'll list this. Well, what can I do here? Let's do this. I'll just label this problems. And before I continue, I just want to be clear. I'm not listing these things to be combative. I'm listing these things because I had kind of a faith crisis when I was growing up because there were people telling me that if I didn't accept a hyper literal view of the flood story, that somehow I was like not a true Christian. There are people who take it that seriously. And so for me, I felt like I was put in this position where I had to choose between like intellectual honesty and a faith that I had been raised in and loved, deeply loved parts of it. And I guess I'm listing these reasons to show that it's not a competition. I don't think there is a contest between the two, but you do have to hold the nuance. And so anyway, for the sake of context, yeah, we're on geological problems. The amount of water that is portrayed in the text of Genesis. Basically, there's more water in that narrative than there is on the earth today, because it says that the water covered the tallest mountain, especially if you're seeing this as a worldwide flood. Today, the earth has around 332 million cubic miles of water. That's filling the deepest basin, the deepest ocean. To just try to imagine what this is, a cubic mile is, for those who maybe are not into math or geometry, that means the amount of space within where you have a mile in height, 1 mile in length, and 1 mile in width. So the amount of space that fills currently on the earth today, 332 million of these. So, I mean, and if you're thinking like, how do I conceptualize a mile? Unless you're a runner, maybe you don't have a good concept of that. So a mile would be like if you're driving on the interstate or the freeway, and like we have mile markers. That's because every exit number is, generally speaking, a mile apart. So if you're on just an average stretch of interstate, you have exit 68 here, and then over here you have exit 69. There has been a mile of road in between those 2 points. So think about that all the way up. I mean, that's like 15 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other, a mile this way, a mile back, and then all the space in between. Times that by 332 million. That's the amount of water currently on the earth. Now, in the model presented in Genesis chapter 6, where water has to cover the tops of every mountain, in order to accomplish that, you would need at least 4 billion cubic miles on the low side. Some estimates will place that at upwards of 7 and toward 10 billion cubic miles. So on the low side, that is 12 times the amount of water that we have. And I guess the question really is, where did it come from and where did it go? Like that old song says, where did it come from? Where did it go? Cotton Eye Joe. In an old ancient Near Eastern model, they could answer that very well. Well, the water came from, the waters above, and they burst forth from the waters below. And then once the flood subsided, it just kind of drained back underneath the earth into the abyss. But in a modern understanding of the universe and of the world, that obviously just doesn't work. And water cannot evaporate, at least not that quickly. I think it was about a year or something like that. They were floating around. There's no way that water goes anywhere. So those are just the geological problems. You end up with a bunch of biological and ecological problems. For example, if you ask the question, what is the minimum number of species that Noah had to preserve on the ark for us to have the diversification that we have today with modern species of animals? And the reality is, if you have any understanding of how the nature of natural evolution occurs, if we're saying that this flood only occurred about 5,000 years ago, then Noah essentially needs the same amount of species that exist on the earth today. He needs millions and millions and millions of animals, millions of species. This is basically just based on standard speciation rates according to science, and also factoring in concerns about inbreeding. Now, when you throw in like young Earth creationist creation science models, they do tend to rely on that phrase, which we'll get to, about according to their kinds. So they're going to say, no, it wasn't every species, it was just every kind that could evolve into multiple or even thousands of species. But even when you're looking at their models, you have to have minimum 7,000 kinds of animals present on that ark. And they do try to make it work, but boy, that's like animal abuse. I mean, they are crammed in that poor box. Basically, on average, you're going to have enough space for every animal to have a 4x4 crate. And that packs all 3 levels of the ark before you even factor in food. You are basically at that point, I mean, even if you accept that young earth creation science model, you're going to have to say that magically there was no need for food or water storage, which actually contradicts the text of Genesis where it says he brought food on the ark for all of them. You're also going to have to say that there's no need for waste management. There's, where are we going to put their urine and their bowel movements?
Off the side, I guess.
But where? How are you going to feed it through the skylight? You're only one. It says they get one window. So the young Earth creation science model, they put this skylight window. I think some models are on the top, or some is like around the side. But even then, you're going to have to shove. I mean, it's just days and days and days all day long. All you're doing is 8 people taking care of 7,000 animals, shoveling manure and trying to collect urine and stuff, bringing it from the lower 2 decks to the upper deck to shovel it out your one window. It's just not very feasible. That's not even mentioning a need for cleaning the animals and cleaning your space to make sure that disease isn't spreading. So you almost have to say, like, magically in this moment there's no disease, not to mention there's no predator-prey issues between animals, that they're all living in peace and harmony, and they're perfectly amenable to these humans taking care of them, and it's just kumbaya. They're just trying to survive. When you consider all of that, basically the ark is like the Garden of Eden. Like at that point, it's almost just this magical perfection, because otherwise it's not feasible. And those are just the problems within the ark. There are a whole lot of problems that this narrative poses outside the ark, namely that a global flood would completely sterilize the soil. There's no way that you could grow anything on the ground after a global flood, probably for thousands of years, but definitely not within that generation. It would kill every pollinator, it would destroy any existing freshwater ecosystem, and it would collapse all of the food chains, because keep in mind, the level of pressure that would be pushed upon the earth with all of that water would cause so much tectonic plate shift. It would generate so much heat that all of the experts say the oceans would boil. That's how hot it would get. So it would kill everything. That means no surviving fish, but certainly no way that you're going to be able to plant crops a year later. This is probably under maybe some biological, but I'll just be more specific here, genetic concerns. The genetic record does not show a bottleneck, a reproductive bottleneck 5,000 years ago. And there's also some archaeological concerns, because we can actually go to regions like Sumer and Egypt and the Indus Valley and China and show that civilization still was moving on during this proposed window. You would expect in the archaeological record, if this was a worldwide flood, for all civilizations to stop simultaneously. But not only do we have no evidence that civilizations stopped, we have counter evidence to show that civilizations kept moving on and living their lives. They were not affected by an event like this. But like I said, I'm not listing these things to be combative. Let's say we can just disregard. Let's disregard all of this. My biggest problem with the narrative that we receive from the text has to do with the dimensions of the ark specifically, because this kind of a barge was only meant to endure in stable waters. That is to say, the flood waters peacefully come up and lift the ark, and they stay up there peacefully for a year and change, and then they peacefully recede. But practically speaking, what we know about our earth and how it would have responded to such a cataclysmic event, these were not peaceful waters whatsoever. I talked about that pressure, that immense pressure that billions of cubic miles of water would have on the earth. It would also have immense pressures on the mountains and quite literally would crumble mountains away. You'd have huge chunks of mountain just breaking away and flowing away with the current. You would also have no continents. So because the water is now covering the continents, which tend to slow down, like the wind and the general current, now you just have nothing to stop the momentum, and you're going to have huge, huge waves. So all of that being said, assuming you can ignore all of this, assuming this is not a problem, and you can magically wish that away, you still have to find a way to understand or to rationalize how this vessel is going to survive a bunch of debris that is literally the size of cities, maybe states, with the earth breaking up and the mountains collapsing, and waves the size of countries, perhaps even continents. And it says those floodwaters persist for 40 days and 40 nights. If Noah had been building a steel ark, if this thing was made all of metal and reinforced steel, it is still, under these conditions, going to fracture and flood and eventually break apart, maybe even snap in half. If you're talking about a wooden vessel, we're not even talking about breaking like a pencil. This thing is going to violently disintegrate between the waves and all the debris smacking into the side of it. If we are looking at this story hyper literally and what would have happened, truthfully, it would have been more merciful for someone on day 1 outside of that ark than for someone on day 5 inside that ark. They are going to suffer horrific deaths. Horrific deaths. And if we are taking the text's word for it, that these conditions persisted for 40 days and 40 nights, I don't even think there is a day 5. I think this thing breaks apart within 40 hours, if they're lucky. So all of that to say, if you're approaching this from a hyper-literal perspective, you kind of have to like throw some magic or the hand of God into that situation. You're going to have to say, well, God literally, I mean, he closed the door of the ark with his hand, right? God literally held that thing together the entire time that it's out on the waters. And at that point, I'm just going to beg the question, why go through all that trouble to have them build this thing? And, you know, I can hear some of the apologists in me, you know, saying like, you know, the exercise of faith and being obedient, and God's going to take care of the rest and hold it together. And maybe there's some spiritual principle we can glean from that. But I just mean practically, this ark is a useless exercise if God has to hold all that together. I think it would make far more sense for God to take them on a journey up to the highest mountain, have them hole out a base inside the mountain, and send 2 billion cubic miles less of water so that it doesn't go to the very, very top, and they stay stationed, safe, holed up in the mountain. And you can still see a faith aspect of that story without having to go through this exercise of like, this ark is somehow going to preserve them. It will not, at least in a literal sense.
I guess by having even the mountaintops covered, it's like not a single thing has even a chance of surviving.
Correct.
Maybe that's why we don't know what gopher wood is. Maybe gopher wood is like sacred magic wood that like is unbreakable.
There you go. I fell over. Did you see that?
I did see that.
This is not nearly as complicated if you approach the scriptures from any sort of proper exegesis, proper ancient interpretation, and say, maybe in the same way that the authors of Genesis we're borrowing from existing creation myths to demythologize the pagan elements and then respin it, retell that narrative with the God of Israel at the center. Maybe in the same way, it is borrowing from existing flood myth, demythologizing the pagan elements, respinning it, reinterpreting it with the God of Israel at the center as a narrative about the people that came from this. It's an origin story of the covenant people. And then you just leave it at that, knowing that this is just what do they call it? An etiology. An etiological narrative is just a way to explain where something came from. And in this case, the where something came from is, where did covenant people come from? What was the origin of God's covenant people? And I think specifically some of these patterns of saving a remnant through divine providence to some degree. That becomes a theme through the rest of the Old Testament, indeed through the rest of Christian and Latter-day Saint literature, and I don't see a need to make it any more complicated than that.
It's really interesting how you keep, mentioning how they're taking existing myths and folklores of other traditions and, co-opting them, making them into their own. And, I mean, if you think about it, that's a really good way, their kids, presumably, especially if they're, like, in, traveling groups and stuff, they're going to come across these stories and they're going to wonder about them. But if you say, oh, no, that's our story, this is how it really goes and all that stuff, it helps cement a cultural identifier. And after 3 generations, when they hear that story, they're going to assume it was actually stolen from them instead of, vice versa. And you hear that kind of thing. You hear that kind of thing with people who were Muslim, and and they read the Quran and all these stories that are like their stories, and then find out after reading the Bible, wait, a lot of these stories actually are very similar to Old Testament stories.
Yeah.
And then if you look at, like, okay, well, which one's older? The Old Testament, clearly, and they realize, oh, some of our stories were probably just kind of co-opted and made our own from existing Jewish stories. And I don't know, when I was serving my mission, I met a woman like that who said she became, I don't recall if she became Jewish or Christian, but she left her Islamic faith because she said, I wanted to get to the core, I wanted to get to the original.
Oh, interesting.
And I realized the Quran was not the original.
Interesting.
It was our version that came later. And it was just, I was really surprised and really fascinated by that. And I was like, that's a very good point. Yeah.
I feel that way every time I visit a Jewish Shabbat service. I there's this feeling of, like, I mean, I know there's a beauty of existing in this, like, restored covenantal community that definitely tethers back to some old stuff, but it is something else to be standing among people who basically, that people group has been practicing this without stop from the beginning. That's really, really interesting. And it's funny you mentioned the Quran, because the Quran has a flood narrative. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Quran has a flood story. It's the exact same story, except Noah has a 4th son. And I can't remember his name, but he has a 4th son. And it's kind of a beautiful narrative. It allows you to see kind of a different side of the spiritual elements even happening here, because the 4th son, I could be butchering this, by the way, I haven't read it in a long time, but my recollection is that the 4th son does not believe that a flood is coming. He is against his father. He's kind of like the Laman Lemuel of the group. And he denies this, is clearly wicked to some degree, and basically just blows it off. And when Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their wives get into the ark, they beg him to come in, and he says no. God shuts the ark, the floodwaters burst forth, and the Quran depicts this 4th son clinging to the side of the ark, wishing that he had, and so you can definitely see, like, an appreciation of, like, certain elements that get told in different traditions.
Teaching additional lessons too.
Yeah. And it's the same with the book of Moses. That's why I say I don't teach Genesis and Moses, or I try not to teach Genesis and Moses and Abraham. meshed together. I know that's really common, but they serve different rhetorical purposes, and it's important to see them in those contexts for the people they were written, because the elements of the narrative do change enough to change the meaning behind some things. Anyway, I think that's probably where I'd like to end this. Thank you for your insight on that. I wasn't even thinking about bringing this up, so that's great. Thank you for watching. I will leave these things with you in the name of Jesus Christ.